back to Red Ice Creations Radio. This is our first program of 2008, and I am your host Henrik Palmgren, and we are coming to you from Sweden in Scandinavia. A warm welcome to regulars and new listeners wherever you might be. The website is redicecreations.com, and we are in for an exciting new year. Lots of new things are going to be launched this year, and one of them, of course, being our live shows. We're a few steps away from our first live program, but do stay tuned. Much more on that is coming. Okay, for this program here today, we are going to focus on the issue of global warming. We have Michael Coffman with us on the line. Michael is currently president of Environmental Perspectives Incorporated and the executive director of Sovereignty International. And I recently saw his film called Global Warming or Global Governance that we're going to talk more about here today. You might also have seen him in Alex Jones' film Endgame, where he was prominently featured in the 1.5 version of that film. The websites that you can take a look at and follow along here during our program today is globalwarmingglobalgovernance.com. But also do take a look at sovereignty.net and discerningtoday.org for much more on that. So let's say welcome to Michael Coffman to the program. Nice to have you here, sir, and thank you for coming on Red Ice Creations Radio.
Well, you're more than welcome. I'm glad to be aboard.
Excellent. We're going to begin here today to talk a little bit about the science, I guess, of global warming, and then later on talk more about the global governance aspect of this in our second segment. But first, Michael, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background, if you will, in regards, I guess, to your environmental studies.
Yes, I have a PhD in ecosystems analysis and have been involved in research and teaching for about 25 years when I was tapped to lead a multi-million-dollar research effort on the effects of global warming on our nation's forests and ecosystems. And in the process of doing that, I became very, very concerned. Initially, I really believed that man was causing global warming because of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions. But as I got into more and more of the research just was not holding that up. And as a result, I eventually began to do research on the side as to what is going on behind the scenes to be able to drive this agenda on the global warming, the biodiversity, and a number of other issues that, they have some merit in truth, and there's some link to truth, but at the same time, the scientific evidence just was not very strong in supporting what the world, or the United Nations and others, were claiming were actually happening. And as a consequence, what I found was that there was a huge agenda out there, basically using these surrogate issues like global warming to convince citizens of the world to give up their freedoms and to ascribe to what they call global governance. And it was at that point that I left my job and began to really do efforts in order to help people understand what is really behind a lot of these environmental scare stories. Yeah.
So, I mean, when did your kind of alarm bells, I guess, first, went off, so to speak, in regards to the hype, I guess we could say, of global warming?
Yes, exactly. It was global warming that really began to make me aware that there was something more beyond just the science and the efforts to protect our environment. I'm all for protecting our environment. Don't get me wrong. We do have environmental problems.
Yeah.
But at the same time, global warming is an issue that we can't do much about because the science that exists basically supports the concept that it's a natural part of a natural cycle, not man-caused.
Sure. Exactly. I mean, let's talk a little bit about that, the reality and the science behind it. I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you is, do you think that there is some kind of, how should I put it, dramatic climate change happening right now on Earth?
No, I really don't. What is happening is really not that dramatic. If you go back in time, even in the last 10,000 years since the last ice age, you will find where climate has changed, where Earth has warmed by several degrees within a matter of several hundred years. So what we're experiencing right now is not that untypical of what has happened in the past, relatively recent past, as far as geologic time is concerned.
Well, exactly. I mean, that was one of my questions here in regards to if we, humanity, kind of have the proper perspective on climate change, considering that we haven't, studied and monitored climate change for such a long time, right?
That is correct. We have an ability to kind of piece together the history of Earth's climate through paleontologic work and other types of activities that will help us to understand what the temperatures were, what the CO2 levels were, and so forth, and through geologic time, or at least back through the several 100,000 years. It's not perfect. Any one measurement is probably subject to error, but as a trend, I think it gives us a fairly accurate picture of what has happened in the past.
And in this, we have a few things I guess we could refer to. We've had something called the Little Ice Age, and then we have something called the Medieval Optimal. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, very much so. In fact, what we're experiencing here is nothing more, what we believe, is the response or the recovery from what is known as the Little Ice Age, which occurred back in the 1617 and early 1800s, where it was a full degree to a degree and a half colder than it is right now. That's where in Europe you had crop failures, we had plagues, they had a number of things where it was a very rough time to live during that 200 to 300 year period. And now we're recovering from that. We're going back to more optimal conditions that existed back around 1,000 years ago. Starting about 800 BC to about 1200 BC, it was considerably warmer than it is right now, up to a degree warmer than it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time it was called the medieval optimal, and at that time is when you had some of the major, in Europe, some of the major expansions, the big cathedral building and so forth.
Yeah.
It was a time of a much better time because it was much warmer. Generally speaking, both man and nature does much better when it's warmer than when it's colder.
That's a very interesting aspect, and let's return to that a little bit later and talk about, some of the advantages, I guess, of CO2 and so forth. But there's so much information out there now, and of course conflicting information in regards to what is true and what is not. When it comes to science, we have, we're shown hockey sticks and graphs of ichor samples, and how the heck can we sort out, what is true and what is not here?
Well, that's the problem, because the mainstream media, probably in Europe as well as here in the United States, has taken this as almost a cause, where they're not trying to give both sides of the picture, but only one side of the picture. And what we're seeing is what I believe to be a deliberate effort on the part of some of the international community to portray a picture where man is causing global warming with this utter catastrophe awaiting for us if we do not do something immediately, like initiate the Kyoto Protocol. Mm-hmm. And what concerns me the most about this is the average person has no way to discern unless they start digging into it. And you really don't have to dig into it very far before you start finding some of the truth. But on the average, when you're going about your day-to-day business, there's really no way you can determine exactly what is truth and what is false. And because the media has almost had this constant drumbeat, especially the last 10 years,
mm-hmm.
that man is causing global warming, at least here in this country, and probably is true in Europe too,
sure,
that 80% of the people believe that man is causing global warming. Now, some of them don't believe it as much as others, but at the same time, it's a given as far as most people are concerned.
Sure, yeah, that's right. And it seems to be really kind of catched on because before that, it seems like there were proponents, so to speak, of global warming around, but they weren't given, that much, time in the media and so forth. But then all of a sudden, incredibly increasing, all the big media outlets out there were starting to focus on this. What do you think were kind of the turning point in that, phase, so to speak?
Well, I think we are in a turning point, and I think it may be very much to the truth advantage. 2007 turned out to be a very significant year for peer-reviewed published research in the sense that a number of things were found that tend to discredit the man-caused global warming theory. So, depending upon what happens in 2008, we may see the ability to begin to bring some of the hard facts to the people of the world, basically. It's not just the United States, there's not just Europe, but it's
sure.
The entire world that's involved in this.
Yeah.
And help the people to understand that, maybe we aren't in the crisis, and the best policy is to let's do some more research, let's take a hard look at this before we make any major global policy decisions.
So what you're talking about here is you're saying that we should be a little bit more conservative, I guess, in that regard, because and don't kind of rush into this, because this could, I don't know, this could even affect the climate in a way that we aren't aware of yet, right?
Well, that is very true, and that's one of the things that is not mentioned. I'm glad you brought that up. I don't normally think of bringing that up in a radio program, is that if we embark upon a program such as the Kyoto Protocol, which I know is not working very well even in Europe at this particular point in time because it's so draconian and has such a horrible consequence on the economies of nations that try to do it. But if that were actually implemented, and we did reduce the gross domestic product of the various nations implementing it by as much as 10% or something, it would have serious economic consequences, and we would not have the ability financially to carry out what we need to do to protect the environment, and it will have downstream adverse environmental consequences, just as you're suggesting, as well as economic consequences.
Yeah, let's return also to that a little bit later and talk about the things that is going on with the laws and so forth, and potentially carbon tax going in and all that. But I would like to spend a little bit of time and kind of talking about the your film, of course, Global Warming or Global Governance, and in that film, I think you excellently point out a few of the kind of how should I put it, the consensus of the science out there. One, of course, is that I mentioned before, the hockey stick graph, and one is the ice core samples. But if you will, talk a little bit about the so-called hockey stick.
Well, that's a very good point. In 2001, the work was done in 1998, led by a research team led by a person by the name of Michael Mann. And in that process, they did a statistical analysis of all the temperatures over the last 1,000 years or so. And what they did is, and you've seen this on television and your newspaper and so forth, showing that we've had a relatively stable temperature over the last 1,000 years until the mid part of the 20th century, when all of a sudden it started to skyrocket. And if you look at that, it looks like a hockey stick on its back, where the actual puck part is sticking up in the air. That's why they call it the hockey stick. Mm-hmm. And that particular curve was featured in the 2001 United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report. That we just got another one in 2007, but in 2001 that particular graph was featured, and it was featured in a way to point out that it was a smoking gun to prove that man was causing global warming, and much media attention was given to it back in those days, and actually it was the proof. Finally, they had the proof that man was causing global warming. Well, it was interesting because the United Nations did not do any background check on the science involved in creating that graph, and the scientists themselves that did the graph, or did actually create it, would refuse to release the data they used to any other scientist to verify it for a number of years. And finally, a team in Canada, led by David McIntyre and McKendrick, and two economists basically that are very well versed in statistics, finally found out that the data set that they used, and were able to get that data set and then run their own analysis using the data, or using the statistical packages that were used by Michael Mann and the others. And what they found was that you could put any type of data in. You could put random data in this statistical package, and when you used it, it would come out with a hockey stick. It didn't matter what kind of data you used. And as a consequence, the hockey stick was pretty well thrashed and discredited by this team in Canada, and they were able to say, I think fairly conclusively, that the hockey stick was an invalid use of statistics and was not an accurate portrayal of exactly what the temperatures have been doing over the last 1,000 to 4,000 years. And in 2007, when the IPCC issued its I think it's the fourth report, the hockey stick wasn't even